It's nice to be interviewed here. My name is Dick Fellman, and we're sitting in my home in Omaha in 2004. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska on May 30th, 1935, at what was then Methodist Hospital at 36th and Cumming Street. The hospital there is long gone. Today it's at 84th and Dodge, and there's a Salvation Army headquarters in what was then, I'm told, a brand new hospital. And I've lived in Omaha my entire life, except for being what was then out of town when I went to college in Lincoln and to law school in Lincoln, and for a brief tour in the Army. But other than that, I've really lived here in Omaha, Nebraska my entire life. My parents are Leon Fellman and Frances Fellman, who were also both born in Omaha. And I have two sisters and a brother. I married Beverly Bloom in 1964, and we have four children. Susan, our oldest, who's now married to Isaac Witkowski. Susan's a doctor, finishing this year her third year in pediatric residency. She has a little girl named Gabby, and she's expecting a child in a few months. Our second daughter is Debbie. Our third child is Jonathan, a son who now lives in San Francisco, married to Michelle. They have two little girls. And our fourth child is Daniel, who got married just a couple of months ago to Melissa. And I suppose I should tell you a little bit more about them, which I'll be happy to do, but I want to go back a little bit in the family because as a kid, I always listened to my father and mother, my grandmother, talk about who they were related to and where they came from, and I used to go ask questions. As a child, I always was interested in my family's history. And I remember listening and asking questions of my father. One of my grandmothers, Bertha Green, lived into her middle 80s and died when I was finishing law school. The last few years of her life, I used to go over to her house and sit with her in the afternoon sometimes, just visiting, and listened and asked her questions and listened to the stories of her coming from Europe and her being a young woman here in Omaha. Just the last few months, I was fiddling around late one evening trying to pick up the family history stuff that the Mormons have developed. And I never got into their website or whatever it is, but I accidentally got a hold of somebody that said, put in the name of your family and the name of the town they came from. So I put in Fellman, and I know the shtetl, the small town in Russia that the Fellman family lived in, which was called Lechovitz. So I put in Fellman and Lechovitz, and boom. I was talking to a fellow named Arthur Bass over in email in New York City. And I told him that the Fellman family, from what I know, consisted of about 12 children and a father and a mother. The woman's name was Hava, and the man's name was Laser. And the Laser died fairly young, in his 50s. Hava lived into her 90s. And as a result of the Laser dying, that's in Hebrew Eliezer, and there are Fellmans named every variety of that in English. There's Louis Fellman and Louis Fellmans. My father was Leon Fellman. So I was talking to this fellow, or emailing back and forth, and I said to him, I've got a picture in my family of Hava Fellman. And he emailed back and he said, is she a small woman wearing a white shawl in a big chair? And I said, yeah, and she looks as if she doesn't have any teeth. He said, that's my great-grandmother. I said, that's my great-grandmother. And it turns out that I'm sure he and I are cousins because we've each got this same picture. It was in my father's house. My sister has it. Mary Fellman has a copy of that picture on her wall. We've all seen it in the Fellman family. So here's what I've discovered, some of which I knew and some of which I've learned. Hava and Laser Fellman lived in Lechovitz, which is a shtetl, a very small town in the western Ukraine. The Ukraine is the capital of the Ukraine is Kiev, in Russia or in the Ukraine today, and the big city about 150 or 200 miles west of Kiev is Zhytomyr. In Yiddish, they always called it Zhytomyr. In Russian, it's Zhytomyr. And Lechovitz is a small village, probably 30 or 40 miles north of Zhytomyr, and it's in the province of Volhynia. If you look on a map today, you can see the province of Volhynia. The borders were called the Grenets. And I'm not sure if the word Grenets is Yiddish or Russian. My grandfather, whose Hebrew name was Gershon Fellman, and in America he was known as Harry Fellman, my grandfather, Harry Fellman, was the next to the youngest of about 12 children of Chava and Eliezer, or Lazer Fellman. The Russians at that time, he was born about 1870 in Lechovitz. And at that time, there was in the 1890s, the Tsar of Russia was conscripting men into military service, and they took Jews along with everybody else. Life for a Jewish soldier was very, very rough and mean. My grandfather was conscripted and served in the Russian army. I remember as a child during World War II, my dad was in the American Army, and he taught me how to drill, how to say right face and left face, and he knew how to say it in Russian because his father had taught him those commands during the First World War in Russian. I don't remember the commands. At any rate, my grandfather, Harry Fellman, won a medal for marksmanship, and with the medal came a 30-day furlough. He went home to his mother, who was then a widow, and he told his mother that he was going to go AWOL, leave without permission, and come to America. And according to the story, his mother in Yiddish told him, "Remember, you're a Jew." He left Russia and came to the United States through Ellis Island in New York, stayed in New York City for a short time, and then he came to Omaha, which probably in the late 1890s, 1898, 99, right around then. Omaha had been a boom town in the 80s, in the 1880s and early 90s. There was a big economic collapse, but Omaha was considered then to be a second Chicago, for whatever that means. There were cattle being brought here from the south, from Texas and Oklahoma. There were big packing houses being built. The railroads, the Union Pacific was here. The Western Union went west from here. And business was pretty good. He came to live with his older sister, whose name was Tema Reisman. Her husband was Sam Reisman. And Sam and Tema Reisman had a big family here in Omaha. There are people who are related to them now. Tamalee Friedman, Willard Friedman's wife, is a great-granddaughter. That whole family, there are many people here who are related, who are great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren. Anyway, my grandfather, Harry, came here. He was Gershon in Russian, and somebody told him that Gershon was not the right name for an American, so he became Harry Fellman. Shortly after that, about the same time, his younger brother, Harry Fellman, was the next to the youngest of that family. His youngest brother, the youngest of this family, who in Yiddish was Shmilik, which is Shmuel, kind of the Russian diminutive of Shmuel or Samuel, came here. And he became Samuel Fellman. He had children. Morris Fellman, Mary Fellman's husband, was his son. Betty, he had a daughter, Betty. He had other children that I could trace. He lived here. And then two nephews came. One named Jake, or actually Jake's name was Gershon. And then Gershon had a brother named Sucher. Sucher became S. Fellman. He ran the testing station in Omaha for safety testing for cars. He had 4 or 5 children. Gershon became Jake, and he had another 4 or 5 children, including Abe Fellman, who was a doctor here for many years. And so there were these 4 men, 2 of whom were uncles to the other 2. and there was a Gershon in each one. One of the sons and one of the nephews was a Gershon. I surmise that they had a grandfather or an uncle or somebody whose name was Gershon in Russia, and that man died, and these two kids, these two boys, were named after them. At any rate, my grandfather, Harry Fellman, came to Omaha in his early 20s, just before the turn of the century, the 1800 to 1900, and he began working as a peddler. He was peddling junk, and he would go to one of the larger scrap metal yards. One was run by the Fair family, one was run by the Milder family. They all came from this same area in the western Ukraine. And as I understand it, they would give him, he would have to pay them a daily rental for a horse and wagon, and they would give him a few dollars, $5 or $10, to buy scrap metal. And he would go out on a route and come back at the end of the day and sell his scrap metal and pay them a rental fee for the horse and wagon. After a few years, he married. His wife, who was my paternal grandmother, his maiden name was Wine. Her name was Esther Wine. And there's a family here in Omaha now named Wine. Her mother and father came to Omaha. Her father's name was Mayor Wine, and he was a peddler too, Mayor Wine. My father remembers telling me, or my father told me stories of going out with his grandfather, Mayor Wine, whose home was around 18th and Nicholas. And his grandmother, whose name I don't know, would fix a lunch for them. And they would go out, and it would be an all-day trip from 18th and Nicholas to Dundee, 49th and Dodge. And they would make the rounds of homes in Dundee, buying old bottles or pieces of scrap metal, and then they would go back and sell it. And my father told me stories of how much he enjoyed going out with his grandfather on these peddling routes. My father also remembered and told me how he remembers the tornado of 1913, where one of his uncles, who died young, picked him up in a wagon, horse and wagon, and drove him around to see the damage from that 1913 tornado. The Wine family has an interesting name situation in that their name in Europe was Routman or Reutman. And supposedly the story is that when they were coming through Ellis Island, somebody said Reut, like in wine, and the immigration official wrote down wine. So the family that should have been named Reutman or Rothman or something like that is known here as Wine. And there's been many people from that family here in Omaha from the Wine family. Esther Wine and Harry Fellman married each other right around 1900 or 1901. They had 4 children. The oldest was a daughter named Rose, who married a man named Bob Mayer, and they have 2 children. Rose died just a few years ago, lived well into her 90s. She was 93 or 94, maybe 95 when she died. She has a daughter, Sally, who's married to a man named Bernie Johnish. And she had a son who's still living in California, named Harold, or Brad, he now goes by. And my father, Leon, was the second child in that family. He had a younger brother, Saul Fellman, who married Evelyn Swyback. And Saul and Evelyn had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, Mark. And then my father had a 4th sibling, Anne, who married Abe Slesky. And they had 2 sons, Howard and Jerry Slesky. My father told me stories of his father, Harry. Esther, of course, was home all the time, taking care of the family. When my father was born in 1908, the family lived on about 11th and Capitol, which is where the World Herald building, right around where the World Herald building is now. My grandfather, Harry, had built 2 or 3 houses right in a row, lived in one, sold one, and rented one out. And after a few years, he established his own scrap metal yard in his backyard, where they had horses, and he had some people working for him. From what I'm told, he began to do relatively well. My father went to grade school at Cass School, which is now, which is about 13th or 14th in Cass, right in the middle of the interstate highway right now. That school in those days was a rough place. My dad said that half the students, the boys, served time in the penitentiary for rough crimes, and the other half became doctors and lawyers and dentists and did very well. The family moved to Myrtle Avenue and about 32nd Street, just north of the old Technical High School, which is now the headquarters of the Omaha Public Schools. In between times, my grandfather got out of the junk business because it was affecting his health, and he ultimately had emphysema and bronchial problems, which caused his death in the late 30s. And he was in a grocery store that didn't work, and he owned a half interest in a bar that didn't work, and he then got back into the scrap metal business, which he understood. He bought a pretty nice home on 31st or 32nd and Myrtle Avenue. That area, I think, was called Lincoln Boulevard, which was right near there. Had a lot of Jewish families in it at that time, and it was one of the nicer neighborhoods, not the fanciest, but one of the nicer neighborhoods that a lot of immigrant Jewish families lived in. My father started high school at Central High, and after the first year, after his freshman year, his father got sick, and he had to drop out of high school for a year. This was in the middle 20s. In those days, most men that dropped out of high school really never went back. But my father wanted to go to college, so he went back. He was afraid to go back to Central because he thought he might not finish, so he went to Tech because he could learn a trade. He took auto mechanics and bookkeeping. I'm not sure the auto mechanics he ever applied, except he was constantly buying and selling cars. The bookkeeping he really learned pretty well because he went on to make a good deal of money and left a nice estate for his family in real estate, and he understood bookkeeping very well. But to get back to his story, he went back to Tech High School a year behind his class, finished Tech, and then enrolled at Creighton University, wanting to be a dentist. He said he never really wanted to be a physician because it took an extra year, and he thought the dentist had a better schedule and a better lifestyle because they didn't have to worry about getting calls in the evening. He worked at a store on North 24th Street called the Star Store. It was owned by a man named Levinson, Charlie Levinson, who was kind of a shirt-tail relative. Charlie Levinson's wife and Rose Mayer, my father's sister's husband, were brother and sister. And my dad sold shoes at Charlie Levinson's store on North 24th Street. It was then one of the larger stores, and Jewish people who lived in that neighborhood would remember the Star Store. And he became the head of the shoe department there while he was going to college and dental school. Charlie Levinson, my dad said, wanted him to take out Charlie's daughter. My father never wanted to take the girl out. But my father was attracted to a young woman who was working as a clerk at that store, whose name was Frances Green. And the two of them ended up getting married in 1932, which was the year that my father graduated from dental school. He told me one story. The stock market crashed in 1929, and the economic depression began really right then and in 1930. My dad said that he had the money for his senior year tuition in dental school in a bank. The bank was located then at 19th and Farnham in what is today the Service Life Insurance Building. There's a little restaurant, a little deli sort of restaurant there. Many years ago when I moved my law office, into that neighborhood, that block, I took my dad one day across the street and we walked into this building to have lunch, and he looked around and he said, this used to be the bank, and he gave the name of the bank. And he told me this story. He said he had his tuition for his senior year in dental school put in that bank, and it was to pay his way through his last year. The bank closed in the summer of 1931, and all the money was gone. So he had no money to go to dental school. He went to the Jewish Free Loan Association and told them the story. They gave him money for his senior year in dental school with a no-interest loan that he was to begin paying back the year he finished dental school over a 10-year period. So he had money to finish school. He graduated. He did a year's internship at St. Joseph Hospital, and he got married all in the same year. He began paying back that loan. Interestingly enough, he said he paid it back over 10 years, but in 1942, when he sent his last payment, World War II was going on. He was then in the Army overseas, and he sent the last payment. And about a year or two later, the bank had recovered and been sold to somebody else, and the bank started repaying the loan over a period of 10 years, and so he got his money back. The difference was that he lost the money in 1931 dollars, and he paid it back in the dollars, the value between 1932 and 1942, and he received the money back in dollars from about 1948 to 1958, which meant there was a real loss of purchasing power, though the dollars remained the same. They were married, my mother and father, Francis and Leon, were married in 1932. Now, the background of my mother's family, her maiden name was Frances Green. Her father was Meyer Green, and her mother was Bertha Shafton Green. Meyer Green's family lived in St. Petersburg and came to this country fairly early as immigrants go, I think in the late 1880s. Meyer Green was about 10 years old. I'm told, I didn't know him. I'm told that he spoke English without an accent, and I've seen his handwriting, and he wrote English very well. He went to grade school here for a few years. Meyer Green's father, Isaac Green, was a horse trainer in St. Petersburg and sold horses to one of the big Russian circuses that toured around Europe. The Tsar, in Russia in the early 1880s, 1883, a large pogrom came into being, and they made life very miserable for Jews. At that point, the Pale of Settlement was established. Jews were moved into a designated area, which excluded St. Petersburg, then the capital of Russia. And at that point, I think Isaac Green, and the name in Russia was Grun, I think similar to Ben Gurion. I think the similar name, because Ben Gurion changed his name. It means in Hebrew, son of a lion, and has nothing to do with the name Grun in Russian, or the Yiddish name. At any rate, Isaac Green brought his wife and family here. Meyer was one of his sons. Isaac, I'm told from my family, remained a horse trainer. He would go down to the stockyards in South Omaha and buy a few horses. And I don't know where he went to train them, but he trained them to be circus horses. And when the Russian circus traveled through the United States, they would stop here in Omaha every year or two and buy horses from him. And this is how he made his living. He had a number of children, 5 or 6 children. Meyer was one of them. Meyer Green was a fruit peddler with a horse and buggy, together with his brother Simon Green. And Simon Green had family here in Omaha. I'm sorry, it's not Simon, was one of his sons. I think the brother's name was Morris Green. Simon was the son of Morris. Simon and my mother were about the same age. At any rate, Meyer and Morris, in the wintertime, would work My grandfather Meyer Green and his brother Morris shared a horse and wagon, and in the wintertime they would travel around door to door selling vegetables. In the wintertime in those days it was cold still, and the vegetables they had were potatoes, onions, turnips. that would cover up to keep the snow from getting on the wagon. My father-in-law, Harold Bloom, Bev's father, told me that he remembers Meyer Green coming to his mother's home and his mother buying fruit and produce from my grandfather, Meyer Green. In the summertime, Meyer continued the route, and his brother Morris set up a stand in the old market, which today has been redeveloped into a neat little old-fashioned shopping and restaurant and bar area. And they had a stand in the old market. I remember going there with my mother as a child, when I was a child. During the summer, my mother would go and we would buy produce, and she would always take me down and introduce me or tell me to say hello to Uncle Morris, who lived into old age. Meyer Green and his wife Bertha Shafton had 8 children. And Meyer was killed, was run over by a drunken driver in 1929 or so. They lived on North 19th Street. I've seen the house, and it's still there. There's a fire station. It's about 1800 to 20 blocks north of Dodge on 19th Street on the east side of the street. The Abramson family lived right next door. And Meyer and Bertha's oldest daughter, Anne, married the oldest son of the Abramson family, Isidore Abramson. And they were neighbors growing up. At any rate, Meyer was killed when he was taking a chicken to the butcher to be slaughtered for Shabbos. And he was coming home with his chicken. Bertha has a background that I know a little bit about also. Bertha comes from the little town of the shtetl of Kapulya, which there's a large number of people here in Omaha who come from that town. Her maiden name was Shafton. A nephew of hers, Ed Shafton, who practiced law here for many years and died just a few years ago, was a good friend of mine, told me that his mother and father met. His mother lived near Minsk, and his father would walk from Kapulya to Minsk to court his mother. So I assume that the shtetl of Kapulya is near the present city of Minsk, which is north of the Ukraine. It's in what is today White Russia. At any rate, the Shafton family had lived. The parents, Bertha Shafton's family, parents did not come to the United States. She had some brothers and some sisters. Her oldest sister came to Omaha with her husband named Jacobs. Her name was Gittel Jacobs. I don't know her husband's name, but one of their sons was Morris Jacobs. She had a brother, Bertha Shafton had a brother named Shafton, named Todris Shafton, who became a rabbi and who married the daughter of the Vilna Goyen, who the Vilna of Goyen was a major rabbinic figure in Lithuania, in northern Europe, northeastern Europe at that time. Bertha Shafton came to Omaha when she was about 19 or 20 years old with her older brother, Ben Shafton, who was the father of Ed Shafton. Ben Shafton was just about a year or two older than Bertha. And Bertha told me this story. I remember hearing it sitting talking to her in her living room. She and her brother Ben left their parents. Her father was becoming blind. I don't know the cause of the blindness. Her brother, the rabbi, was killed during the 1920s in a pogrom, and the families lost track of each other totally during the 1920s. But Bertha and Ben came to the United States again right around 1898, 1899. They had a little bit of money that they had saved, and they left from Kapulya to Minsk, and then they took the train to Berlin. She said they ran out of money in Berlin, totally out of money. And so at first they ate by picking up scraps of food from the garbage cans of restaurants. Then they began washing dishes. They stayed in Berlin for a few months to make enough money to go on to Hamburg, where they sailed to New York. My grandmother, Bertha Green, told me how wonderful the city of Berlin was. This was just, and she was telling me this in the middle 50s, which was only 8 or 9 years after World War II, where Germans were not too popular and the Nazis were villains as they still are. And she just seemed to skirt all of that. And she knew that Hitler was no good and the Nazis were bad, but she kept talking about the fact that Berlin was a beautiful city. She got to Omaha. Some of her relatives stayed in New York, and somehow or other, either her relatives or Meyer Green's relatives. Meyer Green and had some relatives in New York, and my grandmother Green, Bertha, talked about these as the bad guys. And it is, from what I can put together, one of his brothers or nephews was somehow tied into the mafia. And my mother told stories that when she was a little girl, this relative, things were too hot for this guy to stay in New York, and the relative came to Omaha. And Bertha had these eight kids. My mother was then probably a young teenage girl and was very pretty. And this guy from New York, the relative, stayed at Bertha's home. And he liked my mother. He had money. He never held a job here in Omaha. And he used to give my mother money to go buy clothing. And my grandmother wouldn't let my mother take the money because my grandmother knew it was sort of hot money. And she didn't like the idea that this cousin or brother of her husband's was somehow a con artist. And my mother said he stayed here for 6 months to a year and never worked, had plenty of money, and then he went back to New York. I don't know much about that end of the family. At any rate, Bertha Shafton came here and worked as in a small factory, a garment factory, making some sort of garment. And then she and Meyer Green married. They had 8 children. My mother, Frances, was the 5th of those 8. The other children were Anne, the oldest, and then there was Nate Green, who's married. These people are all dead now. And after Nate, there was Art Green, who lived in Omaha and married Dorothy Marglin, and has a daughter, Shelley Stern, and a son, Michael. There was another brother, Eddie Green, who married a woman named Rose. They had no children. Then came my mother. Then there were younger children, Irvin Green, who never married. Everybody knew him as Ichi, or the Colonel. He was a PFC in the Army, but he was called the Colonel. And there were a couple of daughters, one Ethel, who married a doctor in Pittsburgh, and another Phyllis, who is still alive today, the only one and the youngest, who married a Dr. Lou Dimsdale in Sioux City. As I say, my mother grew up here in Omaha as one of 8 children. Her father was a peddler. Her mother, Bertha Green, was the dominant one in that family. They never made much money, and her husband died very young, in his late 50s. Art Green, my mother's brother, one of my mother's brothers, was a reporter for the World Herald, a police reporter, and he was actually assigned to cover the auto accident where his father was killed. When he realized who it was, the World Herald sent another reporter out. So my mother's father died, and Bertha Green lived on North 19th Street. My mother and father were attracted to each other. My mother, my father always said, was this pretty young woman who he began to like when they were working together in the Star Store. My mother went to college, was the first, went to Omaha U then, and took a 2-year course in education. In those days, if you went to college for 2 years and majored in education, you could get a teaching certificate and you could teach. And so in about 1930 or 31, after graduating from Central High School, she finished 2 years and she began teaching. She taught at Vinton School on about 20th and Vinton Street. I think she took the crosstown streetcar from probably 24th near Lake all the way south to Vinton and walked a couple of blocks. She and my father were married in September of 1932. My father had graduated from dental school in the spring of 32. They were married on Labor Day. They took a one-day honeymoon to Des Moines because that's the only time he could get off from his internship at St. Joe Hospital. And they lived with her mother on 19th Street. I've been in that home. It still exists. There's a living room and a dining room and a kitchen and a small bedroom, which was Bertha Green's downstairs. And upstairs there are 3 bedrooms. There is 1 bathroom in the house. Upstairs lived Phyllis and Ethel in 1 bedroom, and each and Art and Eddie in a 2nd bedroom, and my mother and father lived in the 3rd bedroom. And my mother and father lived there and saved money, and in 1934 bought a lot at 53rd and Blondo in what was then a relatively new neighborhood called Country Club, and they built a home. My father told me, or my mother told me, that her mother thought that 53rd and Blondo was in Kishinev, way off in a way. But they lived there for about 5 years, and I was born when they lived there in 1935. Meanwhile, going back to 1932, my dad began and opened up his own dental office. Didn't want to work for a doctor who wanted him, a Dr. Gordon, and opened up his own office in a physician's office. He rented a room from a physician in the Medical Arts Building, and he began going one day a week to Gretna, which is a suburb of Omaha now, about 20 miles, 25 miles west of Omaha. And then it was a small town. And there was a doctor in Gretna who had a little dental office behind his office, whom he rented out to young dentists who would come there. This was in the depths of the Depression, and my father and mother told stories of how they were paid in the summer and this time of the year in August in produce, in tomatoes and fresh vegetables, or with chickens, because the people didn't have any money. My dad did this for about a year or so, and then he opened his own dental office in the Brandeis Theater building on 17th and Douglas Street, which was then a relatively prominent office building. It had a lot of doctors and dentists and lawyers, professional people in it. It was right across the street from Brandeis department store, and there was a large theater on the first floor of the office building. I remember going to my father's office at 722 Brandeis Theater building all the time as a child. I loved it. You could take the elevator from the building downstairs and you would be in the lower level of Brandeis store. There was a big cafeteria there that all kinds of people used to have lunch at, and my father would take me there and have lunch with me. My mother worked for a short time for a while as a dental assistant to him. I think she took a short course at some community college so she could be a dental assistant, but she was really a school teacher. And she taught 2nd grade, and she always talked about the fact that she was a school teacher and she had gone to college. None of her sisters, until her youngest sister, went to college. Just a few weeks ago, Dundee Grade School, where I went to grade school, had a 100th anniversary. And there was a teacher there named Elizabeth McCluskey, who was then about 93 or 94. She was my 4th grade teacher, and she and my mother went to Central High School together and to Omaha U together. And when I went up and said hello to Miss McCluskey, told her I was Francis Green's son, she remembered right away that Francis Green was a classmate of hers and how tough it was to get jobs in the 30s. My mother and father were married, as I said. They built a home. I was born in 1935. My father had a very successful dental practice. They joined, though my father and mother both grew up in the Orthodox synagogues, my father grew up in the what was called the Rosh Shul on 18th in Chicago, which was the Russian-Ukrainian synagogue. My mother's family, coming from St. Petersburg and around Minsk, belonged to the other Orthodox shul, the two big ones, and that was called the Litvische shul. And it was sort of an intermarriage of sorts when somebody from the Litvische shul would marry somebody from the Russische shul. The Litvaks thought they were a little bit better than the Ukrainian Jews from who they referred to as the Russische. But be that as it may, the intermarriage worked. And my dad and mother were doing very well. My father had gone through college and had taken ROTC because they paid him, I think, $15 or $20 a month for the last 2 years of college. And he remained a reserve officer in the Army. In about my sister Jane was born in 1938. We're 3 years apart. My father's father died in 1937. I have vague memories of going over to their home during Shiva. I really don't remember Harry Fellman. Esther Fellman lived and died in about 1949. I was in high school then, and she lived at our house. I remember Esther very well. Meyer Green I didn't know at all. He died in the auto accident when he was killed. But my middle name is Mayer, and I'm named after him. I have a cousin Myra. I have a cousin Michael. I have a cousin Marvin. We're all named after him. My mother and father bought a lot to build a new home on 53rd and Farnham. I think they bought that lot in 1940 or very early, late 1940. And they sold their home on 53rd and Blondo. We lived for about 6 months in a rented duplex on 50th and Davenport. And then we moved into our new home in the fall of 41, in September or October of 41, on 53rd and Farnham. I began grade school at Harrison in kindergarten. And then when we moved to this duplex at 50th and Davenport, I switched to Dundee about halfway through my kindergarten year. And then I went to Dundee grade school from kindergarten through 8th grade. We moved to this new duplex, and war was going on in Europe, but it was before Pearl Harbor. My father had Army orders to report to active duty before Pearl Harbor. He was able to get a deferment because his home was under construction. And I think he got a deferment twice. I remember Pearl Harbor, December 7th, that day, because he said he would be going into the Army very quickly. And within a couple of months, he was in uniform down in Texas. And we lived there, and I lived in that home, that duplex, at 301 South 53rd Street from 1941 until I got married. Never moved out of there. My father lived there for a few years after that, after my mother died. And so that really was the home that I grew up in. World War II was a major, major influence in my life because my father was away. My mother told me that we didn't have money for a new winter coat, but my father was patriotic. He was serving his country. He was sent down to Texas, and I remember he had orders to go overseas. So my mother took me on a train down to Texas, and we were going to drive his car back to Omaha. And we spent some time down in Abilene, Texas, where he was in the Army. He was in an engineer regiment of some sort. They ended up in the Aleutian Islands, where they were building the Alaska-Canadian highway. And the Aleutian Islands in the early part of World War II was a combat zone. The Japanese submarines were in that area, and there was some shelling and some combat in that area. But getting back to Texas, I went down to Texas, and we stayed there for a couple of weeks, I think, and I just thought it was great. My dad hated it. The weather was lousy, it was rainy and muddy, and they lived in tents. But my dad had a Jeep and a driver, and I thought it was just really wonderful. And then I got sick. I had pneumonia. They had just come out with sulfa, and it was a new drug, and they didn't really know much about how it affected children. I remember being in a hotel room, and my father, who was a dentist, bringing in 3 or 4 friends of his who were physicians. They were all Jewish doctors, and one of them was a pediatrician. The Army didn't have much use for a pediatrician. And these 3 or 4 doctors stood around my bed discussing the fact that they thought sulfa would take care of the pneumonia, but they didn't know what the correct dosage was for a child. And so my dad told his commanding officer that he was going AWOL, and he would meet the troop ship or the troop train in Seattle at Fort Lewis, Washington, and he drove me home back to Texas, and met up with his Army unit at Fort Lewis, Washington, and Tacoma, Washington, and then sailed up to Alaska. He was there for about 4 or 5 months and broke his arm very badly in some sort of an accident, and then went back to Fort Sheridan in Chicago. And my mother and sister and I went there, and we spent most of the summer of '42 in Chicago. Housing was impossible to find. And I remember my father, who was in a big cast from his arm, his whole left arm was in a cast, going door to door, knocking on doors, asking if he could rent a room for his family. We finally got a room in the servants' quarters of a big home in Lake Forest. We had 1 bedroom. There was another bedroom rented to a sailor and his wife, and a 3rd bedroom. We lived in a home owned by Mrs. Simpson. And she had a cat, I remember. And the big fancy home in front of the servants' home had a wealthy family living right off Sheridan Road in Lake Forest. They had a son who was a little older than me, but I couldn't play with him because we were part of the Army, and we could not mix with the people who lived there. We had 1 bedroom, and we had 1/2 of 1 shelf in the refrigerator to put our food. And my mother told me that if my sister Janie and I fought with each other and made noise, they would kick us out of that place. And we would have no place to live. And as a result, my sister Janie and I didn't fight as children, because I was afraid that if I was guilty of fighting, the family would be on the street. And as a result, I never really learned how to fight with my siblings. And it's a problem I've had to this day. I wish I knew how to fight with my siblings a little better. And my sister Jane and I have never really had an argument because we were taught very early not to do that. World War II went on for 3 years, and I went to school that fall in some place in Chicago. And that winter, my father was stationed at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. We went up to Wisconsin. We lived in an attic that year. And the only heat we had was the heat that came through an open radiator. And we'd go into bed at night. My mother bundled us up wearing socks and coats and scarves and stocking caps because it was really cold. And I went to school for about a month in northern Wisconsin in a 1-room schoolhouse with a potbelly stove in the middle. Then we came back to Omaha. And the Hebrew school teachers got mad at me because they said I was always behind. And I really, really liked Hebrew school, but I was constantly being told that I was behind. In school, I was doing okay. The next summer, the summer of '43, we shared a home outside of a little town near this Camp McCoy with another Jewish family from New Jersey, a doctor. His name was it was Major Parrott, I knew him as. I know one of his sons became a doctor. We had, I think, the 2nd floor, and the parents had the 3rd floor, and the 1st floor was common territory. My mother cooked the food for 1 week, and Mrs. Parrott cooked the food for the other week, and we had a wonderful time living there that summer. And my father was in and out of operations trying to fix up his arm, which ultimately got fixed up with some metal in the arm and a couple of screws. You could touch the screw and feel where the screwdriver went. Then a year or so later, after that, he was transferred to what was then Camp Campbell, Kentucky. It's now Fort Campbell. And then we moved down to Kentucky and Tennessee. The Army post was right on the state line. We lived in Clarksville, Tennessee, in a little house, a 4-room house, a living room, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. And there were like 6 blocks of houses that were all identical. There was no phone in any of the homes. There was a pay phone on the street. And everybody there was in the Army. And my mother was then pregnant with with two children. It became twins, my brother Tom and my sister Nancy. They were born in July of 44. I went to school in the spring of 44 in Tennessee, and then Janie and I started school again in the fall of 44. When Nancy and Tommy were born, my father was an Army dentist, and my mother didn't know she was going to have twins until about 2 or 3 weeks before. I remember vividly, we were going to meet my dad for dinner, and she had an appointment with the doctor who was delivering the babies. And my mother told Janie and me to wait in the waiting room. It would take about 15, 20 minutes. And she was in that doctor's office for 2 hours. When she came out, she took us out to the street, and she said she was going to have twins. The doctor took an x-ray, which they would never do now, and saw the two heads of the twins. Supposedly, she told my grandmother in Omaha that she had a dream that she was going to have twins, because she wanted to lay a little groundwork. A few weeks later, the twins were born, and my father called Bertha Green and said that Frances had twins. And the story I've been told is Bertha said to him, "Leo, are you drunk? You're in the Army, are you drunk?" And he said, "No, she had twins." And he said, "You're sure you're not drunk, Leo, because I know what soldiers do." And he said, "No, they're twins." So Tommy and Nancy were born. I played a vital role in that, not in the pregnancy, of course, but in getting the doctor. We had no telephone, and my mother was worried that my father would be on the Army post. So I was rehearsed and given a nickel. My mother kept some nickels at home, and my mother walked with me from our house down the block on a gravel road to where the telephone was. And I could barely reach, I was 9 years old, I could reach up and barely get that nickel into the slot on the payphone. And she made me memorize the phone number of the dental clinic. And I had the responsibility of calling my father to tell him that my mother was ready to have him come home. I had no notion that my father certainly told whoever answered the telephone in the dental clinic about me and what was going to happen. And so they were prepared. But I remember worrying that I would call and talk to somebody in this dental clinic, and I had to ask for Captain Fellman and tell him that I was Captain Fellman's son. And when I made the call, they were very nice. My father came, and Tommy and Nancy were born. And we stayed in Tennessee till around November of that year, the year 1944. When I got back to Omaha, I was in Miss McCluskey's room in Dundee School, and they wanted to hold me back and put me back in the 3rd grade because I had missed so much school, and I didn't know how to do long division or long multiplication, or didn't know how to, I don't know. In Tennessee, I was considered a Yankee and an Army bred. And the teachers would come by. I'm sure I was not a problem kid, but the teacher would come by with a ruler and spank me on my hand. And I really disliked school there. I came back to Omaha, and lo and behold, Elizabeth McCluskey was my teacher. She and my mother had been young friends as young women. And Elizabeth McCluskey let me come to school an hour early at 8 o'clock every morning for about 3 or 4 months. And she tutored me and brought me up to date. She told me just a few months ago that she remembered that very well, and she said that I was a very interested and involved student, and I wanted to learn, and so it was a pleasure for her, to teach me. And from then on out, I went right through school at Dundee School. My mother had absolutely no sympathy if I came home complaining about a teacher. The teacher was correct, and I was not. And I remember coming home and telling her that the teacher, Miss Linehan in the 5th grade, was mean to me and did this or that. And my mother would put up with none of that and marched me right back. The same with Hebrew school. I went to Hebrew school. I really kind of liked it, but I was afraid to admit it because it wasn't politically correct to like Hebrew school. We lived on 53rd Street, and I used to walk from 53rd and Farnham to Dundee School on 51st and Davenport. And then I'd walk from 51st and Davenport to 49th and Farnham for Hebrew school. My grandmother, Esther Fellman, had a little apartment on 50th and Capitol for about a year or so. And I would stop there on my way to Hebrew school. She'd always give me donuts or fruit or something. And then I'd go to Hebrew school. Then I'd walk home from Bethel at 49th and Farnham to 53rd and Farnham. Now, my mother always had her own car from the 40s, but I can never, ever remember my mother taking me to school or picking me up, regardless of the weather. As a child, we lived at 53rd and Farnham, and I was involved in. I started playing drums, and I remember once I used to have to carry a little snare drum to school, and then to Hebrew school, after school, and back home. Once on a snowy winter day, I lost a drumstick, and my mother found that out as I came home. "Where's your second drumstick, Dick?" And I said, "I lost it." She sent me back in a snowstorm to try to find that drumstick. I never thought I'd find it. Somehow or other I did, and I brought it home. Her response was, "See, Dick, I knew you could find it." She was a very strong mother, and a very strong father. We had in our home Shabbos dinner every Friday night. It was interesting. My father had a very good, solid background Judaically. He liked it. We had Jewish books around the home that he read. My mother had not as much of an academic background, didn't really know Hebrew much, but she read Yiddish. She knew Yiddish, I think, really better than my father's, and she could write letters in Yiddish. They were both raised in Orthodox homes, but they, as a young married couple, joined the Reformed Temple. And so what we had was an observant Reform family. We had a Friday night service at our dinner that comes right out of the Union Prayer Book of the classic Reform. But the discussion around the table was not the typical Reform family. I began going to Hebrew school when I was 5 years old, or Sunday school, at Temple Israel, the Reform Temple. My father and mother were friends with a young rabbi, David Wise, who left Omaha for, I think, the East Coast and ended up in Philadelphia. Then there was a Rabbi Lelyveld who came to Temple Israel. And the story I'm told from my father was that Rabbi Lelyveld, when I was about 7 years old or so, told my father that he said, "Leon, your son Richard likes this and is a good student, and he really isn't going to get what he should have in Jewish background at the temple." Rabbi Lelyveld and my father were friends, and Rabbi Lelyveld told my father, he said, "Leon, your little boy Richard is a good student, and he's not going to get a good Jewish background here at Temple. You really ought to send him to Bethel, where there's a better Hebrew school." We lived just a few blocks, 5 or 6 blocks from Bethel. So I was enrolled in Hebrew school at Bethel. For a few years, my parents belonged to both Temple and Bethel. And then they dropped, I think, when they raised the dues at Temple and said you have to be a full member. And my father wasn't about to pay that kind of money to 2 synagogues, because my father was a pretty tough businessman. They dropped Temple, and we stayed at Bethel. And I've been at Bethel since I started Hebrew school there when I was about 8 years old. The last 2 years, I just finished serving as president of Bethel. I thoroughly enjoyed the 2 years. I would have gone on for another 2 years, but 2 years is enough for the good of the synagogue. But at any rate, we had this home that officially we belonged to the conservative movement. We went to services at Bethel. Rabbi David Goldstein at first, and then Rabbi Kripke. But we had inside, we didn't keep kosher. We didn't have pork. My mother would once in a great while, maybe once a year, slip some ham into the house that she liked. My father didn't like ham at all. We never had bacon. We never had pork or shellfish or anything like that. Outside, I don't recall my parents ever eating any of these things outside, except my mother would have a bacon and tomato sandwich sometimes. But inside the home, it was really rather observant. We had Pesach Seders at our house for the whole family. We would have dinners at the holidays. We celebrated all the Jewish holidays. My mother and her friends who lived in the neighborhood, a Sis Turner and a Frida Verrett, I remember, would walk from our immediate neighborhood to Bethel for Yizkor services after Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot. Um, I grew up in an environment that was very Jewish and also very, very very American. My mother told me that I didn't appreciate the fact that my mother, spoke English and could go talk to the school teachers without having me be embarrassed. And she was telling the truth. I really didn't appreciate it. The Jewish thing, let's get back to that for a second. I went to Hebrew school, and even in high school, I went to the Hebrew high school lessons at the old Jewish Community Center after school. Then for a couple of years, Rabbi Kripke had a wonderful class on an afternoon. We studied Milton Steinberg's book, Basic Judaism, that was then new. And I really thought at that time that I might become a rabbi, except I didn't tell anybody this. And Rabbi Kripke gave me the impression that in order to be a rabbi, you had to be absolutely brilliant like he was. And I knew I was not that brilliant. But at any rate, going back to my schooling, I was never much of an athlete at all. When they would choose up sides, I was the seventh or eighth kid on the ninth kid to be picked for a baseball team. And the only reason I was seventh or eighth is that the ninth guy was kind of the oddball. And I was not an oddball, but I was a poor athlete. On the other hand, I got involved in Boy Scouts, which I really liked. And I did very well in the Scouts. I became an Eagle Scout. I went to a jamboree in Austria in 1951 that was a mind-opening experience for me. It was just 6 years after World War II. You could still see blocks of rubble piled up in Germany and Austria. We had an audience with the Pope in Rome. We walked around in Paris. We saw the prostitutes in the red light district. And the whole experience of going to Europe that summer made the world seem small to me, and made me think that I didn't really have to go away to college to get away from my family, because I saw what the world was like, and I realized that I could do just as well if I wanted to and remain much closer to home. In high school, I became very active. I guess my political stuff began then when I became the president of a club, Jewish club, Re'im, in high school, and got all involved in that. And then the Jewish Youth Council, and I was the president of the Jewish Youth Council. I played in the high school band, the drums. I had my own little band in high school, and I played with a bunch of very good musicians. Tuffy Epstein, who's a professional musician, Frank Tiro, who became the dean of the Yale School of Music with a PhD from the University of Chicago in music. I began as a junior or senior in high school to listen to these guys I was playing with, and I realized they could hear things that I couldn't hear. They could play by ear, and I couldn't play by ear. And I have never played since high school, except I enjoy playing the piano once in a while on Sunday afternoon. Bev says that my piano playing is a poor version of what you hear in elevators. It amounts to music from the Broadway musicals that I play kind of not very well. And I don't want anybody to listen to my piano playing, but we've got a piano in the living room, and I like it. During high school, I also was on the debate team. And I really, I don't mean to be cocky, but I really starred on the debate team in high school. Warren Swyback and I won the state tournament as seniors. We went to the national tournament with the school principal as our escort, J. Arthur Nelson. The year before, Karen McKee was a wonderful woman and is still a friend of mine. She and I won the state debate tournament, but the principal wouldn't let us go to the national tournament. And I spent a lot of time in high school debating. I learned that I liked history and English, and I learned equally well I did not like physics or chemistry, and math was something I could do without. My dad told me to take a course in bookkeeping, which I took, and the teacher told me halfway through the course, she said, "Are you here because your father wants you to take this?" And I said, "Yes," and she laughed. the physics teacher pulled me aside and he said, "Your dad's a dentist and you've got uncles that are doctors?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you thinking about being a doctor?" And I said, "Well, I'm thinking about it." And he said to me, "Dick, you're not going to like pre-med, you're not going to like medical school, but when you get into your psychiatric residency, you'll be at home." And he said, "Have you thought about being a lawyer?" And I said, "Yeah, I've thought about that." He said, "I think you'd do way better because you like that kind of stuff." I also held a part-time job, first at Rank's Army Store, owned by Lou Katz and Sam Goodman, where I sold mittens and boots and hats. And then I got a really better job selling shoes at Baker's Shoe Store, which was right next to Brandeis, a ladies' shoe store. It had low-priced but high-style shoes. A guy named Mr. Isaacs, Joe Isaacs, ran the store, and he had a bunch of salesmen, a bunch of Jewish guys like me. There were Jews and Italians and Greeks who were the salesmen there. I learned how to talk to people, especially women, and to sell ladies' shoes on a busy Saturday afternoon in those days, and to handle 3 or 4 customers at the same time was not a lot different than talking to a jury of strangers, or talking to a class that I'm now teaching at UNO. And it taught me how to approach somebody I didn't know at all and sell them. And Mr. Isaacs used to say, when he got done selling a pair of shoes, he'd say, "Show him a satchel, son. That's a purse. And sell him some shoe polish." The commission was 7%. And if you had $100 worth of sales, the shoes were priced at $3.99, $4.99, ladies' high heels at $6.99. The most expensive shoe in the store was $7.98, and that was a pair of fancy high heels, 3-inch heels. If you ran a book of $100, you made $7, which was an average Saturday. If you just before Easter or around Christmas, you could sell $200 worth of shoes and make $14 a day, and that was really big money to me in those days. And I sold shoes one summer in college. I finished high school in 1953 with a very good high school record. My favorite teacher was Marion Mortensen, the debate coach, who died of leukemia, which my mother later died of, between my junior and senior year. She liked me and helped me. She went to J. Arthur Nelson, and I'm sure it was her influence, and I was sent as a delegate to Boys State down in Lincoln, which was a high honor in those days and still is. And I was doing pretty well. I was in the upper 10% or so of my class, right below the 10% level, and I didn't know where I wanted to go to college. I was admitted to Dartmouth and Penn, the Wharton School, and I didn't get admitted to Yale or Harvard. I later discovered that the reason I didn't get admitted to Yale or Harvard was that I didn't ask J. Arthur. And the reason I got admitted to Dartmouth was that I was an Eagle Scout, and he figured that anybody who was an Eagle Scout would like the outdoors in New Hampshire. And I got admitted to Penn because he wrote a letter to the Wharton School, and he knew that my father had been a successful businessman, investor in real estate as well as a dental practice. So, and he put students where he thought they belonged if they didn't go and talk to him. And for reasons that I really don't understand, I did not want to go to Dartmouth or Penn. I had a Regents scholarship, and I went down to Lincoln to college. I remember vividly talking to my father when he was dying of cancer many, many years later, saying, I've sort of regretted I should have gone to Dartmouth. He looked at me. He was sick and dying. He said to me, "Dick, you did very well in Lincoln. Shouldn't be ashamed of that at all." And that was the end of the discussion. There was no more discussion. I went to Lincoln, and I joined the ZBT fraternity. I won the prize as the worst pledge in the ZBT class that year, and I never had much to do with the fraternity. I lived there forever, through college and then through a couple of years of law school. And I liked the people, but the basic premise of the fraternity world I always thought was wrong. I detested pledgeship. I was getting top grades in an English class, getting A+s in a weekly theme, and the president of the fraternity discovered that. He had a friend who was the news editor of the Daily Nebraskan. he sent me over to the Daily Nebraskan, and they assigned me the first story to write was to cover a Red Cross, student Red Cross meeting. And the Red Cross meeting lasted till around 5, and then I went down to the Daily Nebraskan office, and it was about 7 till I got done writing the story. And I went back to the fraternity house, and they asked me where I was, because I didn't show up at 4 o'clock for the routine of shining people's shoes and washing people's cars and picking up people's laundry, and I didn't show up for dinner. And they were mad, the guys in the fraternity. And I told them I did an article for the Daily Nebraskan. They called it The Rag. And all of a sudden, I realized that a new world had opened up for me. These guys thought it was wonderful that I was writing for the Daily Nebraskan. I hadn't made the journal. I tried to get on the register staff at Central High, and I didn't make it. And I didn't think I could really write very well till this one professor in college told me I really knew how to write pretty well. And I discovered that I could skip all the junk in a fraternity pledgeship that I didn't like if I went to the office of the Daily Nebraskan. And I could come back to the fraternity house in time for study hall at 7 o'clock. The cook would leave dinner out for me. It was cold, but it was fine. And I was a hero at the fraternity house because the next day they'd see a little byline. Some story in the paper was written by Dick Fellman. And that semester I got very good grades. I won the award for being the worst pledge. And at the end of the first semester I applied and I got a job as a copy editor on the Daily Nebraskan. Copy editor, I think, paid $35 a month, which was a lot of money. It was all the spending money I needed for college. At the same time, my first year down in Lincoln, I began teaching Sunday school at the conservative synagogue. Rabbi Harold Stern was the new rabbi then, and I taught Sunday school. Once in a while I taught afternoon school, and I used to go over on Sunday evening to a little study group at Rabbi Stern. We began reading a book by Will Herberg that was brand new then. If you look at the Siddur today, there are wonderful readings by Will Herberg that Rabbi Jules Harlow put into Sim Shalom. And I remember reading Will Herberg back then. When Rabbi Stern left town for a couple of times, he asked me, and I conducted the Friday night service. That was a point when I wrote to the Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary, and got a letter back because I was interested in going there. They told me to contact Rabbi Sidney Brooks, and I was afraid to. He was at Temple, and he was a little sarcastic, and I didn't know him very well. And I was not attracted. I never wrote to the Jewish Theological Seminary, because even though I was teaching at the conservative synagogue in Lincoln, I thought you had to be brilliant to become a conservative rabbi. And about the same time, I was really getting interested in the newspaper world. I was majoring in political science. I was on the debate team in college. And my world revolved in college around really the Daily Nebraskan, and to a lesser degree the debate team, and to an even lesser degree the ZBT house. To this day I have some very good friends from the Daily Nebraskan who I became friends with back then. A lawyer named Sam Jensen, a law professor named Dick Shagru. These were both people who became editors of the Rag right after me. And we're still good friends, the three of us. Much probably closer friends than I have from the fraternity world. But I went to college. I worked over the summer back in Omaha, and after 3 years I entered law school. I was taking ROTC. I got a degree and I became a member of the Innocent Society. I started courses. I started French. I ended up marrying a French teacher, but I started French twice and dropped it, and then took it over the summer. I did the same with zoology. I ended up graduating with a very nice record in school, and after graduation, if you'd been the editor of the Daily Nebraskan, you could get a job on either the Lincoln Journal or the Lincoln Star. The Star was a Democratic paper, the morning paper that came and you worked on in the evening. I went and interviewed Jimmy Lawrence, the editor of the Star for a job, interviewed with him. He made me come back 3 times. I later learned he did that with everybody. If you wouldn't come back for the third interview, he didn't want you. And he hired me as a reporter. I got $1 an hour pay, and I worked there over the summer at the end of my third year in college. I was the night police reporter. Part of that included writing obituaries late at night, going over to the police station. I did a story once where the neon sign on police, the P and the O were out, and so it became Lice Station, big picture. And the next day the cops wouldn't talk to me because I wrote the story about the Lice Station downtown. But I really liked journalism. I was in law school, and I held a part-time job there. One day they came in and asked me if I'd ever been on a farm. And I laughed and I said no. They said, "Have you ever slept overnight on a farm?" And I said no. And they said, "Well, we need a farm editor of the paper. You're in law school. Congress just passed a new law called the Soil Bank Law. You'll understand the legislation, and we'll help you with the county fair." And so I became the farm editor, still earning $1 an hour. And it was my job to edit the farm page once a week and to cover farm stories. I remember once the next summer when I was the farm editor going out, and they told me to cover the wheat harvest and get a picture of the combines coming through the field. As I was driving to southeast Nebraska, it dawned on me that I didn't know what the devil a combine looked like. And I would have to stop and ask a farmer if there were different machines coming through the field, which one of this was a combine, so I could get the right photo. As it turned out, there were 3 combines coming down the field harvesting wheat, and they were all the same. So I got this great photo, did a story. There was another time when it was a drought in the middle 50s, 56, 57, here in the Midwest, really dry. And the Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, in the Eisenhower administration, came out to Nebraska for a tour. And we were to meet him at about 6 in the morning in Steinert Park in Nebraska City. I drove from Lincoln down to Nebraska City and got there about 5:30 and was standing around with a group of reporters in the national press waiting for the secretary to come. And there was this fellow standing next to me, and he was a little older than me, 5, 6 years older than me. He was dressed up kind of cool in whatever the right suit was at the time. And I introduced myself to him very proud, and I said, "How do you do? I'm Dick Fellman, farm editor of the Lincoln Star." And he said, "Well, it's nice to meet you, Dick. I'm Seth Taylor, farm editor of the New York Times." My ego then went down to 0. And I decided, however, that if this guy was the farm editor of the New York Times, I was going to follow him. And wherever he went and whatever question he asked, I would write down in my pad. And I followed him, and I got a couple of nice stories that day on the Ezra Benson tour. Halfway through that tour, a bunch of ladies on one farm were really angry. And he started giving a speech, and they started throwing tomatoes at him. He was a Mormon leader. He was a wonderful speaker. And he had big tomato blotches on his coat. And he held up his arms, both arms, and he turned to the audience, and he said, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." And by quoting Jesus from the New Testament, he settled down that audience. And I learned a little bit that I later tried to apply in politics, that if you could speak the right way and you could say the right thing, you could handle the meanest audience. I really enjoyed my work with the Lincoln paper, and I was thinking of staying in journalism. My mother gave me tremendous pressure to finish law school and be a lawyer. She said, "Dick, as a lawyer, you can always make a living. You can work for yourself. If you become a newspaper reporter, you're going to be on a job." She had a brother who had been a reporter and didn't do too well. And she said, "You're always going to be working for somebody else." And really pushed me out of journalism into law. I was already in law school. The next summer, when they asked me, a friend, one of the senior editors there, pulled me aside, took me out to, they called it lunch, but it was dinner, about 8 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. And we went and had lunch with the guy who was the Associated Press man, Odell Hanson. He said he had an opening with the AP for about 3 or 4 months. They were between reporters. Would I like to leave the Star and cover the State House as an assistant to him for the Associated Press? I jumped at the opportunity. I think I even made a little more money. They gave me a salary increase. And so I spent about 4 months or so covering the state capitol in Lincoln for the Associated Press. And that was the end of my career in journalism. In law school, I did very well in the moot court. And my partner was Al Ross. We roomed together. He was a member of the ZBT House. He was a few years older than me. And we won the moot court competition our senior year in an elimination contest. And then I was also on the national moot court team. After law school, I had taken ROTC, and in those years at Nebraska, which was a land-grant college, you had to have 2 years of military training. Everybody had to take it. It was required. And I could have gotten out of it, actually, because I had a little bit of asthma. But I was really taken up with the idea of serving my country. I now understand that it came from this childhood experience with my father, who I was told was serving his country. And because of that, I really wanted to become an Army officer. And so I took ROTC. When they had you fill out the medical forms and they asked if you had hay fever or asthma, I just said no. And I carried some pills in my pocket. I don't know what would have happened if I had ended up in a barn with hay and horses as a prisoner of war someplace. I'm not sure what would have happened. But anyway, I went into the Army. I was commissioned. And again, I could have gotten into JAG, the legal branch. It would have taken 2 years or 3 years. Or I had a choice of volunteering for any of the other branches. To me, the guts of the Army was the infantry. It was a few years after the Korean War. Nobody had heard of Vietnam, or at least I hadn't. It was Southeast Asia and it was French. And so I thought place to be is the infantry. And I was finishing law school, and I figured that if I went into the Army, I could be an infantry officer, and if we ended up in a war, the fact that I was a lawyer, I'd end up on the colonel's staff doing something. I had no idea if that was true or false. And so if you volunteer for the infantry in the Army, you get the infantry. And I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry, and after graduation, I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia for about 4 months, 3 months or 4 months as an infantry basic officer school. The most physical thing I've ever done. I was in the best shape I've ever been. I weighed 150 pounds when I got out of there. I could run miles with a pack on my back. And I hit the point where a young soldier didn't salute me, and I had him brace up against the wall, and I said to him, "Private, you didn't salute me." And I walked away thinking to myself, my God, the Army has really gotten through to me. They've gotten me disciplined to the point where I would just follow orders. I served for 6 months as a platoon leader at Fort Riley in the 1st Division, and then I had an 8-year commitment in the reserves. I finished that and was finally discharged with an honorable discharge as a captain in the Army. I never served as a captain. And I really liked the Army summer camp. When I'd get outside, one year I ran a rifle range out at Fort Carson and qualifying everybody in the division, or in our unit, our part of the division, about 3,000 men. One summer I taught the 106 recoilless rifle, which is really antiquated now. It was an anti-tank gun mounted on a Jeep at Fort in Columbia, South Carolina. I went to Fort Sheridan a couple of times, but my highlight of my reserve officer career was what happened with Bev. I was a young lawyer here in Omaha, and I was living at home, which my kids think is impossible. But in those days, there were really no apartments around, and people like me who were from Omaha, young lawyers, doctors, what have you, If they were single, they still lived at home. The people that had apartments were guys from out of town. So I lived at home. I worked for Marks and Clare, Ephraim Marks and Truman Clare as a young lawyer. I stayed there for about 5 years, and Eph Marks really taught me how to practice law. I began dating all kinds of people who I never talked about, never introduced these girls to my mother. Every Friday night I'd come home for Friday night dinner religiously, and I never brought any girls home because I really didn't want my mother to know who I was taking out. Once at an engagement party for my sister Jane, Libby Sachs pulled me aside. Libby Sachs had grown up next to my mother. She was an Abramson. And she asked me who I was dating, and I said nobody. And Belle Katz, Rabbi Katz's wife, Ozzie Nogg's mother, was standing there. And Libby started telling me that there's this very pretty girl named Beverly Bloom who lives across the street from her, who had come back to go to college for the last 2 years in Omaha. Why didn't I call her up? And I shrugged my shoulders. I had no idea why I didn't call her up. I didn't know her. And Belle Katz said to me, Dickie, and I really liked Belle Katz, and I loved Belle Katz said to me, Dickie, promise me that you'll call this Beverly up. So I did. I didn't know that Libby lived across the street from Dina Bloom, and that they shared a cleaning lady, and that the next day Libby told the cleaning lady, and the cleaning lady told Dina, and everybody knew that I was to call except me. So when I called, I stumbled into this pre-arranged little deal. I went to pick Bev up on a blind date. I walked in the front door. She came downstairs. I remember what she was wearing. She had on a brown skirt and a brown print blouse. She came downstairs, walked to the front door where I was standing, looked at me, turned around and walked upstairs. Came down 2 minutes later. She had switched from 3-inch high heels to flats. And I'd sold ladies' shoes for a few years, and I noticed it. It was years later we were married when I told her, and she had no idea that I realized what she was doing. And she and I began dating, Bev and I. She was going to Omaha U or UNO at the time. I was a young lawyer. I'd pick her up sometimes after class. We'd have dinner together. And we were dating off and on. She said that I would take her out during the school year, and then over the summer I wouldn't call her when other girls came home from college. But then in the fall again, I'd call her. And at one point, when she was a senior, I thought that was enough. I was sort of tired of dating Bev Bloom. And I helped her. She was a French major. She was very pretty and very smart. And I was already fiddling around in politics. And I had a good friend who was an assistant to Senator McGovern. I called this fella and I said, I got this girlfriend, I don't think I'd use the name girlfriend, who's majoring in French and would like to work in Paris. Can you help her get a job with the American Embassy? And lo and behold, she applied, and she did get the job. She thinks she got the job on her merit. I think I got the job for her politically. I think there's a little truth to both. By the time she graduated college, we were getting kind of serious, and I really wanted to get married to her. And she was going off to Paris, and I figured once she goes to Paris, she's gone, Dickie. You're not going to get her. And she left. She graduated, and she left. And meanwhile, I had orders to go to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, which is a hot hellhole in the summertime, for summer camp. And I got on the phone and started calling around and applied for a transfer to, I wanted to get Army orders to go to Paris. The lady at the headquarters down here at the 16th Corps told me, she said, Lieutenant Fellman, Colonel Venardi is a colonel, and it took him 2 years to get orders to go to Rome. There's no way you're going to get orders. And I said, well, if I submit the application, will you process it? She said, yes. She didn't know that I had a couple of friends. One guy was in the Army with at Fort Benning, and then again at Fort Riley, who was then a speechwriter for the Secretary of Defense. And I got a hold of him, Phil O'Dean, and another fellow I was good friends with was Bob Cutak, a lawyer who built the Cutak law firm here in Omaha, who was then an assistant to Senator Ruska, who was a major Republican senator on the Hill. And I got a hold of Bob Cutak. And within about 6 weeks, I had orders to active duty in Paris, France, in late August or September of that summer. And I told them I was going to be in Paris anyway, and could I be ordered to serve my 2 weeks there. And so I got a plane. My dad took me down. I hitchhiked on an airplane, a SAC plane from Omaha to Washington. And my dad took me there, and I caught a plane. I then caught a bus up to New York and flew over to Paris. I was in an Army uniform. I was there a few days before I was to start. I reported in to the Army lieutenant colonel at a little support base, right outside of Paris. I'll never forget it. I was in an Army uniform as a first lieutenant in the infantry with absolutely nothing else in my uniform. And anybody who's been in the service will recognize that there's nothing more blank than a first lieutenant in the infantry with nothing else on his uniform. The colonel looked at my orders and he noticed that there was a special distribution that said, "The Secretary of Defense." The lieutenants don't get orders marked Secretary of Defense. He said to me, "What do you do in civilian life?" I said, "I'm a lawyer." He said, "And you're in the reserve and you've got 2 weeks duty here?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This is an unusual set of orders." And I said, "Yes, sir." He said to me, "Lieutenant, what part of Paris would you like to be in?" And I said, "I'd like to be near the metro." He said, "Fine." He made a phone call to a Major so-and-so. He said, "I'm sending Lieutenant Fellman over to you. Give me a call." By the time I got to the Major's office, he said, "I understand why you're here. They thought I was there on some secret intelligence mission. They never asked and I never offered." And I certainly didn't tell them I was there to see my girlfriend. And so I had a do-nothing job. I reported in at 8 o'clock and I was done around 11 every day. And I spent about 3 weeks in Paris, and Bev and I decided to get engaged and married. And we bought a wedding ring at Cartier, a fancy jeweler in Paris then. I came back to Omaha. Bev finished the fall, went to school in Paris, and came back in November. And then we got married in January. And we lived at first at Twin Towers at 30th and Farnham. I had, about that time, left Marks and Clare, practiced alone for about 6 months, and then Arnie Stern and I opened an office in 1965. We were in the old Omaha National Bank building, which is now the QTAC Rock building, from 65 to 70. And then in 70, we moved to the new Woodman Tower. And Arnie and I stayed together until he left in about 74, 73 or 74. And I stayed there until 1987, 17 years. And then I moved to the Continental building. To tell you the truth, my happiest years as a lawyer were the 8 or 9 years I practiced with Arnie Stern. I handled a first-degree murder case and got an acquittal, and we were doing very well together. I was also in politics. I ran for Congress in 1966 and lost. I knew I would lose. I ran against Glenn Cunningham, who had been in Congress for many years. He supposedly had gotten drunk 2 years before, and I figured if he got drunk again, I'd win. Well, they kept him sober, and I lost, but I got into politics. A few years later, in '69, I was nominated for the city council, but not elected. And then I chaired the Little McGovern Commission, a reform commission, in '71, and got to know Gene Mahoney. In 1964, I was the chairman of the Young Citizens for Johnson and Humphrey, and got to know Jim Exon. And in 1972, I was appointed by Jim Exon, who was then the governor, to fill the balance of a 2-year term in the state legislature. I served for 2 years as a state senator. At the end of the first year, Arnie Stern had left me at my office. I was alone. I brought in a young lawyer, Carl Cohn, and we were having real trouble financially. The state legislature paid $400 a month and was a full-time job for about 6 months of the year. And Bev said to me, by this time we had a couple of kids. We had 4 kids. We had Susie was born in 1966, Debbie in '68, Johnny in '70, and Daniel in '72. And I was appointed to the legislature just a few weeks before Daniel was born. And Bev said to me, "Dick, if you want to stay in the legislature, we'll sell this house that we had bought, a nice 4-room house that we still live in, and we'll move into this smaller duplex that you own, and we'll put all 4 kids in daycare, And she, Bev, will go back teaching school, where she had started teaching at Central High School. And you, Dick, Bev said, can remain in politics. Well, I could understand she was right. So I went down to the governor, to Jim Exon, who was a good friend of mine, and I said, Jim, I got to resign. I'm not going to do it today. You find out, you pick who you want, and tell me, and then I'll submit my resignation, and you can appoint a new senator the same day, and there'll be no political heat for you. He said to me, Dick, have you ever thought of being the Attorney General of Nebraska? And I said to him, Jim, or Governor, have you ever thought about being a general in the Army? And we both laughed. He said to me the Attorney General was not going to run for re-election. There was nobody involved except a county attorney in Lincoln who nobody knew in Omaha. And he said to me, if you'll run for Attorney General, I'll go all around the state and campaign with you and tell people that you're the man I want to be Attorney General. And I said, well, let me go talk to my wife. So I came home and I said, Bev, this is really a good opportunity. If we lose, I will have been exposed all over the state, and everybody will know that I'm a friend of the governor, and that's got to produce legal business. And if I win, I'm only 37 or 38 years old, I'll be a young attorney general. Young attorneys general become governors, federal judges, state U.S. senators. And if nothing else happens, at the end of 4 years, I'll create a Democratic law firm in Omaha and Lincoln, and I'll pick up the banking commissioner and the insurance commissioner, because there is no Democratic firm in handling government work. There still isn't. And I was correct in that analysis. Bev knew it. So I said to the governor, fine, we got a campaign beginning to be organized. It would cost $40,000, Exon and I figured, to campaign statewide for Attorney General in 1974. Well, the last minute in the fall of 73, former governor Frank Morrison announced from no place that he was going to run for Attorney General. I called Jim Exon furious, and he said to me, Dick, I knew you'd call me. Morrison came in today and said he was going to run. There's nothing I can do to stop him. I said to him, Jim, Morrison can't win. He said, I told Morrison that. But he said to me, Dick, you can't beat him in a Democratic primary. So just cool it. I said, you're right. I won't tell a soul. I finished the term as a senator because I had had all kinds of promises, and I had screwed up my law practice for a year. I figured the second year won't do any worse, and I want a good career as a state senator, which I had. And then came back to Omaha, worked again as a lawyer, and did pretty well. 2 years later, there was a vacancy on the county board. And this time, Gene Mahoney and I were the best of friends. He helped me get started. We put together a campaign. Millard Rosenberg wrote a jingle. Dick Fellman for county commissioner. Dick Fellman for county commissioner. The other day, a fellow sang me that song 25 years later. And I won that election, served on the county board, and became the chairman of the county board the fourth year, and then ran for Congress in 80 and again in 82. I did very well. In 80, I ran ahead of President Carter in this congressional district, but I lost. 80 was a big year for the Republicans. Governor Reagan of California was elected president, and then I ran again in 82. And I lost that race, and from then on out, we were beginning to have kids in college, or close to college. Bev taught when we were first married at Central High, taught French as this pretty young French teacher. When Susie was born in 1966, Susie was born on June 30th, and Bev worked through whenever school was over in June, and didn't work again until the middle 80s for about 20 years, 18 to 20 years. Bev stayed home with our 4 children. Susie came, and then 2 years later, Debbie, on leap year day of 1968. Then Johnny in September of 70, and then Daniel in December of 72. I'm very proud of the accomplishments of all 4 of those children. Susie today, Susie took a long time, graduated from Brandeis University in English, was going to be a newspaper writer, and and then worked in domestic violence. Then went to law school at Hastings Law School in San Francisco, did well, and halfway through her second year decided she hated it and quit. Then she was going to be a veterinarian, and I said to her, Susie, I can't support you anymore. Now it's a vet. Pretty soon you're going to be a civil engineer and then an art historian. And we got 3 other kids. She said, fine. And she enrolled in junior college, paid it on credit cards, and started getting A's. Broke up with a boyfriend, which I was delighted, moved back to Omaha. Then we began helping her. She was still going to be a vet. I begged her to take the MCAT. She wanted nothing to do with that. Then one day she called me and she said, I just signed up for the MCAT. Will you pay for it? I said, certainly. She applied for medical school, got in right away. Her first year she did fine. I think her second year she met Isaac. Her third year she was married to Isaac. And her fourth year she had Gabby. And she's now finishing her third year in pediatric residency and expecting another baby in Thanksgiving. Debbie, a very smart girl, was the editor of the Burke High School paper. And Debbie went to Northwestern University, the Medill School of Journalism. Graduated, worked as a newspaper reporter in Northern California. Then came back to Omaha, ended up down in Dallas for a while, got married. It was not a happy marriage. She was divorced. She went back to L.A. She got a wonderful job, ended up as the marketing and public relations director for the Jewish Vocational Service in L.A. And then about a couple of years ago, again decided to get married to a fellow in Dallas who she has just gotten divorced from. This fellow's wife had died, had 4 children, and everybody begged Debbie to go slow. And Debbie is now kind of starting again. Our third child is Jonathan. Johnny went from here to Colgate University in upstate New York, majored in economics, was on the rugby team, did very well in college, then went to Northwestern Law School, where he met Michelle, who was getting a master's degree at Medill at Northwestern. Johnny came back to Omaha, practiced law with QTAC Rock, married Michelle. He wasn't happy after 2 or 3 years at QTAC Rock, went to Chicago to Bank One, where he got into dealing with derivatives and did very, very well with Bank One. He and Michelle had a little girl, Anna, and then he decided that he wanted to leave Bank One just a year and a half or so ago and moved to San Francisco, where he took a job with a hedge fund, where he is starting all over. At Northwest in Chicago, when he was there with Bank One, he got an MBA at the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern. And so he's now got a JD degree and an MBA degree. And he's got 2 daughters, Anna, who's about 3.5, and Samantha, who's about 8 months. Anna and Gabby were born 2 weeks apart. They're now 3.5. One was born, I think, on January 10th, Gabby, and then Anna was born exactly 2 weeks later on January 14th. Gabby calls her cousin Anna, and Anna calls her Gabs. They were both flower girls at Daniel's wedding just a couple of months ago. Our fourth child, Daniel, was born in December of '72. He told Blanche when I was running for Congress in 1980, she asked, Blanche Wise was a Hebrew school teacher. She told me the story that she asked Daniel what he thought about his daddy running for Congress. And Daniel responded, Mrs. Wise, I've been in politics all my life. I like it. He was 8 years old then. Daniel went to Columbia University for a couple of years, then came back to UNO for a year, and then ended up having a very successful time at Colorado College. He got a degree in political science. He wanted to be a rabbi, and it goes way back with him. As a child, he pointed to the rabbi once and said, I could do that. Then when he was about bar mitzvah age, I told my dad that Daniel was interested in being a rabbi, and my dad talked to Daniel. Daniel got very upset and said to me, I didn't want you to tell anybody. I told my dad, who felt terrible, and my dad promised Daniel, this was Grandpa Doc, that he wouldn't tell a soul. And Daniel floated in and out of wanting to be a rabbi. Anyway, he went to the University of Judaism for a couple of years. It didn't really work out too well. And then he transferred and enrolled at Hebrew Union College, where he is now, and he should be ordained. He will be ordained this next spring as a Reform rabbi. He married in June of this year Melissa. He met her at his student pulpit in northern Michigan, in Petoskey, where her mother has a home in Wolverine. So Daniel and Melissa are today in Cincinnati. He received this last spring a Master of Arts in Hebrew Literature, and I think he is on his way. Melissa has an MSW in social work, and I'm sure they will have I hope they have a long, healthy life and a very interesting career. I am extremely proud of all four of our children. They have done extremely well educationally. They've done very well with their occupations. They've had their share of setbacks, and they've overcome them all. And I could not be prouder of those four children. Bev went back to teaching. I think when Daniel was in junior high, she got a master's degree in educational administration, and she went back and began teaching first at Lewis and Clark, and after a couple of years there, she went back to Central High and had her old job back. She has since become the chairman of the International Language Department. She received a Buffett Award with a $10,000 cash gift to her. She turned around and gave that $10,000 back to the Central High Foundation to establish the beginning of a scholarship so that a French student every year could spend a summer living in a home in France speaking French. It was very generous of her. And during the last few years, she has won awards as the best teacher, the best French teacher, and has had some outstanding recognition. She worked, Governor Nelson, Ben Nelson, who was a friend of mine, appointed her to the State Educational TV Commission, where she served as the chairman one year, working with Ron Hull and Jack McBride, major figures in public television in Nebraska. She has now, she's now loves Central High School, and her life revolves around her kids and grandchildren and Central High School. I practiced law for 44 years, and about a year and a half ago set up a new career and began this last January teaching political science at UNO. I have loved it far more than I dreamed I would. I'm teaching courses in American government and a course in Nebraska politics. I'm finding the whole life of a college professor as extremely attractive, but the most pleasant thing is the being in class with students. I had no idea I would like it as much as I have. I'm now 69 and a half. I would love to. I figure I spent 5 years working as a lawyer for somebody else, and then 5 years in the Omaha National Bank building, 17 years in the Woodman Tower, 17 years in the Continental building, and I'd like to kind of reverse that. I'd be lucky if I could have, I hope I'll have at least 5 to 10 years teaching, and I hope if I'm really lucky I'd even have 17 years. I don't know if I'll live that long. But as long as my mind is clear and I can get up and move around, I can think of nothing nicer than to continue teaching. I think I've also been very fortunate through the years in being able to participate in many things in the community. In the Jewish community, I served as chairman of the ADL committee. I've been on the boards of the Jewish Press. I put together the day school after it was closed in 1970. I was the chairman of that from 70 to 72. It's now the Friedel Academy. I chaired one year the Jewish Philanthropy, the General Min's Division. I was on the board of the Federation. But the most pleasant thing I've done in the Jewish community is being on the Bethel board, where I've been now for about 10 years. And I just completed 2 years as president of Bethel. And that far and away has been the most pleasant part of my involvement in the Jewish world. Synagogue, it seems to me, is next to the family, is the central focus of Jewish life. And when you participate in a synagogue, you touch people because births and deaths and weddings and bar mitzvahs are all centered at the synagogue. And people have a concern for a synagogue, if they belong, that goes far beyond what they have B'nai B'rith, where I was the president, or the Federation, or any of this other stuff. And this is not to demean any of the organizations, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but there is a soul in the synagogue that you can feel when you participate. During the last couple of years that I was at Bethel as the president, we've had a new rabbi, a new cantor, a new education director, a new program director. The whole staff almost has changed. We went through that without having any major, nobody yelled and got mad, nobody quit. We had all kinds of problems, and Bethel is today in good shape. I feel very proud of the work I've done there. Bev and I have gone to services every Saturday morning, Shabbat, since the middle 70s when our kids were little. We took the children with us every Saturday. We had Friday night Shabbat dinner here every night from the beginning with the kids. And so we've had a Jewish home. We began to keep a kosher home about 10 years ago. When Daniel was thinking of being a rabbi and Debbie was becoming a little more frum, we decided we ought to start keeping kosher. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, I decided to keep kosher all the time. Began very interestingly, at least to me. It was a Saturday. Daniel and I had been at the synagogue. I was going to Lincoln to buy a new car. It was a German car, a Mercedes. It was Shabbos. I had a kid sitting next to me who said he was going to be a rabbi. I had a big check in my pocket to pay for the car. I thought to myself, I couldn't be doing much worse. I'm violating the Sabbath. I'm driving. I'm buying a German car. I've got a check in my pocket. I'm paying money out. It was August, and I thought I'm going to keep kosher round the clock until Rosh Hashanah, which I did. I want to leave one message, that I love my children and my wife,